Well, welcome back, everyone. We'll get started with our second plenary for the day. Very important topic on how we can respond to disaster and build climate resilient infrastructure and communities in the future. We've got a great panel with us, and to moderate that panel, we have a very distinguished person, Ken Felarsky. He's a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and a lead fellow of the U.S. Green Building Council. It's one of the few professionals that's been recognized with this kind of dual fellowship. He's got multidisciplinary credentials that include the lead accredited professional with a specialty in building design and construction, one of the very first CITES accredited professionals in the world, an AICP certified planner, a certified floodplain manager, and SAP AEER certified disaster assistance trainer, train the trainer, lots and lots of expertise that he brings to the topic. And I think we have an equally distinguished panel that Ken and colleagues have put together to share their perspectives on how we can build back better, build climate resistant infrastructure and communities. So Ken, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Okay, finally,
Perfect.
then thank you very much. Thank you very much
Sure.
for that wonderful introduction, Bill. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. Finally made it. In this panel, we're going to be talking about responding to disasters by building climate resilient infrastructure and communities. My co-panelists are Stacy Bourne, who is also a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. She's a principal architect of the Bourne Group. Shirley Birriel Osorio, director of the Infrastructure Program Management, CDBG program of Puerto Rico Department of Housing. Greg Guannel, director of the Caribbean Green Technology Center of the University of Virgin Islands, and Laura Rivera Carrión, who is the coordinating officer for disaster recovery, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Hopefully you're all in the right day, day two. Bill gave me a wonderful introduction. I won't read this. I'll put it, I happen to be co-chair last year and this year for the American Institute of Architects Disaster Assistance Committee, and we just published the 4th edition of the Disaster Assistance Handbook. It's a wonderful compendium of knowledge, references, case studies in the whole disaster cycle. If you just Google AIA Disaster Assistance Handbook, the page will come up and it'll be available to you for a free download. The emergency management cycle that we normally are aware of: disaster event, then you have response, recovery, and then after recovery, there's the normal and the status quo. And hopefully during that time, there's mitigation and preparedness for the next disaster event. But key to disaster events is communication with each other, with others, before, during events, after events, between events, on purpose, and also by accident. Sometimes it can be planned or it just happenstance. Communication is really a continuum, as many other things. In a holistic approach to disaster and infrastructure resilience, you have the economic prosperity, natural resources, hazard mitigation, climate change adaptation, social equity, health, safety, and wellness. However, there's a gap in that disaster cycle that we've been talking about in the Disaster Assistance Committee. And that gap is between, after the immediate response of getting people and businesses back in their business and recovering and getting status quo in their livelihoods, there's that recovery phase. And usually recovery, because people want to do it quickly, oftentimes it's more of the same. And what we need is time to think there. And it's what I call the design of design, which is you're just developing programs and ideas that, yes, you're building back quickly that you need in the way that you need to do, but at the same time, you have to pause a bit and have some time to think for the future. With sea level rise, what's happening, this is an old projection, actually 2009, you could see they're talking about half a meter, around 2060, something like that. And it's actually been increased since that time. With flood increases, the human impacts, if it's more of the same, there would be 150 to 300 million people flooded using the constant or existing flood protection for that half meter sea level rise. However, if we were looking at more sustainable or enhanced flood protection, the amount of people that will be impacted goes down to 1.1 to 10.1 million people. It's still a great number, but it's not 150 to 300 million. So sustainable measures have a positive impact, but they can't do everything. We know that with disasters, and this is just flooding, the gap is widening between the actual losses and insurance payments for those losses. It used to be 113 billion, but between 1980 and 2020, with all the 285 weather events, the disaster cost is $1.875 trillion. There's a map of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters, and one of the things I've noticed in all these maps when they map disasters and whatnot, as I put down in the lower right-hand side, where's Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands and all this? They don't show up. It's almost looking for where's Waldo. Another one, this was by the New York Times. This is very interesting. You can go county by county and find out the climate impacts that you have. But again, where's Waldo? Where's the Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands? Not there. The National Institute of Building Sciences, they do a tremendous amount of work, but what you can see here is based upon different types of disasters. You have the overall cost-benefit ratio and the cost in billions and the benefits returned, whether you're adopting code, above code, retrofits, upgrading and retrofits. And you could see what happens if you're looking forward to better resilience with better measures, thoughtful measures. There's a tremendous return on investment. You don't see it right away, but what happens is obviously the next disaster event, it doesn't cost as much. So are we being penny wise and pound foolish? Shouldn't we be thinking more like a penny saved is a dollar earned? And it's all about money, money, money. The way we've been doing things in the past is we really should return it to sender. And when will we stop doing this? Help. You're the brains, Butch. Don't worry, you'll think of something. And this is a quote from my son's good friend's grandfather, Buzzy. And I'm going to try to talk like him. He says, the people today, they don't know how to think. So let's do some thinking. Usually we go about projects and think about things in terms of geopolitical boundaries, but they don't show the real picture. Here's a Narragansett Bay watershed that's geospatial. It's not geopolitical, it's geospatial. This is an aha moment. That same Narragansett Bay watershed looked at from the standpoint of the context of our neighboring states and regionally. So you could see that geospatial boundaries in terms of what we experience or what the natural environment does is very different than geopolitical boundaries, but you know this. We look at bioregions and biotomes. Again, geospatial. The ecoregions as mapped by the EPA. And here is a map showing the North America. Again, I apologize, no Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands, but you can see the geopolitical and the geospatial boundaries. Ecoregions across the globe. Here's Native Americans, their tribal boundaries, so to speak, and you can see the overlapping. That's it's not only geospatial, but it's geoecological. Finally, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And one of the advantages that you have is that you are both geopolitical and geospatial at the same time because you're islands. It's all about ecology. And Mobius strip is one of my favorite analogies. You could take a strip of paper, right, built environment on one side, natural environment on the other side, take the two ends, twist them together, and you have a Mobius strip where all of a sudden, instead of two sides of things, you have a seamless and continuous surface where everything is in a continuum. Rhode Island is not the same as, although it has island in the name, it's not the same as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, but as a small example at Rhode Island, as we say, we're 3% bigger at low tide. There's a project that I've been working on over about, well, actually it's been 10, yeah, since it started in 2010. So we're looking at 12 years. Roy Carpenter's Beach, it's privately owned, but all those individual cottages are leased to them by the landowner. This is what Roy Carpenter's looks like back in 2012. Very simple cottages, usually 18 by 32, 24 by 32. Over time, you could see what's happened to Roy's. It started out tents and trailers. Post World War II, they started building these little cabanas. The 38 hurricane, the 44 hurricane, and you could see the boundaries of Roy Carpenter's back in early in the 50s, and also in 2012. And there's an overlay there of the 38 hurricane and the overwash. This is what Roy Carpenter's used to look like prior to the 38 hurricane. Again, this is the overwash from the 38 hurricane. The cottages were destroyed except for a few in the back, and the sand from the ocean and the beach just came inland. And you could see the overwash. That's the way it looks today. And the sea level, with sea level and beach erosion, you could see that between 51 and 2004, there's been a landward movement of the water. Why this is important? Because with 377 cottages, it's an enormous income for the town of South Kingstown, and the amount of damage, if every cottage was severely damaged, according to FEMA, you'd have over $11 million that will come out of the federal coffers to pay for that rebuilding. So what we looked at, we looked at the FEMA flood zone mapping, and again, the same flood zone mapping. You can see the flood zones in the blue with the topo in the orange and yellow. And what we started talking to the cottage owners and the landowners about is moving landward. We looked at the AE zones, how the road was. There's an existing cornfield in the back up towards the road, and so the idea was to move the cottages back. And you can see at the bottom what this was from Superstorm Sandy. You could see what has happened to those cottages. Just a lot of devastation. And so the idea is, what can you do? We calculated where the parking was. Can the cottages be relocated and replaced in a way? And what we're thinking about, using a series of decks where it's almost like a sliding deck segments in between the flood zones, and then also with the decks, we can create an ADA accessible platform, because there are a lot of elderly people who rent those summer cottages. I won't go over this, but there's a whole number of resilience and sustainability strategies that work with the context of Roy's. And this is the overall plan. As you could see, we transfer the cornfield, or we're planning to transfer the cornfield, which is up back in the road towards the beach, and create a coastal cornfield. We call it Roy's corn. And we could actually, what's surprising to us is that we're able to fit all 377 cottages on those sliding decks by moving them backwards and fitting them within the flood zones. The approach to sustainability also works with children. This was the Providence waterfront that we worked with a number of minority children to do this, and their imagination was pretty wonderful. And it goes back again, looking at a new perspective for that period between response, well, actually the recovery period just after response and before you get back into normal. And with that design, the idea is to have a design innovation rapid response team. We call it DIRT. We're working on that in the AI Disaster Assistance Committee. And it's a very simple idea. And as I said, it's in development. It addresses that gap between response and recovery. And what the AIA would do is, based upon a contact made by the community, we would assemble very quickly a multidisciplinary response team using Zoom and other collaborative digital platforms like we're doing now. And also we got to learn about because of COVID. And the team would be customized according to the disaster impacted community, their needs, the demographics of those who are impacted, and the type of disaster that the community has experienced. Now, none of this is easy. And to make things happen, we need to cooperate, coordinate, and obviously collaborate. And with that, we could do things efficiently, effectively, and elegantly. It's a continuum, one design step at a time, of landscapes, buildings, and neighborhoods. And famous last words: connect, cooperate, coordinate, collaborate, and communicate. This is a favorite book. What happened here? Missed a slide. This is from a book, A House is a House for Me, by Mary Ellen Hoberman. I thought I had a slide of the actual book. And it's wonderfully illustrated. It's got a wonderful language, almost poetic throughout. And each creature that's known has a house of its own. Oh, there is, slides got mixed up. I'm sorry. That's the book, A House is a House for Me. And the earth is a house for us all. I mean, it sends a wonderful message. And it's really true that earth is our house. So again, the Mobius strip of disaster assistance and communication. And I believe with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague on the Disaster Assistance Committee, Stacy Bourne, who's also works in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Stacy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ken, for the introduction. My name is Stacy Bourne. I'm the principal architect of the Bourne Group. We practice hurricane resilient architecture in the United States Virgin Islands for over 27 years. Interesting. And I'll be presenting to you the building climate resilient infrastructure and communities. And as Ken mentioned, I serve on the American Institute of Architects Disaster Assistance Task Force, along with other colleagues. Today, I will be talking to you about the rhythm and lifestyles of hurricane season in the Virgin Islands, as well as in the Caribbean. So that is climate change in the Caribbean, the hurricane season, the rhythm of hurricane recovery, the rhythm of rebuilding, and the rhythm of community. So climate change, when I talk about climate change in the Caribbean, I'm talking about the long-term change in the average weather pattern. And we can see from the areas that are indicated on the slide that the blue areas are all of those areas that will be affected. And of course, the green areas are more affected, yellow and red having more implications. And actually, when you dive further into this information and you zoom in, you'll see that the smaller islands can't be represented appropriately with the correct color because of the scale. And we know that these weather extremes in the Caribbean cause a rise in sea level, which Ken had already mentioned. That produces stronger hurricanes as well. And we will have longer dry seasons and shorter wet seasons. And as a result, this will affect all of our economies. This will affect our environments, as well as the populations in the Caribbean and Caribbean nations. We are aware, and Ken also mentioned, that the sea level rising will be 2 degrees, and that will cause extreme hurricane rainfall. And the rise in sea level is 10 feet. And for most of us in our coastal communities, 10 feet is quite significant. If you begin to think of downtown Charlotte Amalie and St. Thomas, right, as a coastal town, that will have a tremendous effect, as well as throughout the Caribbean. Over 30 million people live below this threshold. And one of the greatest Caribbean nations that will be affected is the island of Bahamas, because 80% of their island is below sea level. Also, the small states' resilience and national disaster and climate change has identified that since 1950, the Caribbean has had over 511 disasters. 324 of those were in the Caribbean. And we know that almost 250,000 people have been killed and over 24 million people have been affected in some form or fashion, either through their livelihoods, through the loss of their home, or injuries throughout their families. We also see a trend that talks about urbanization in the Caribbean, Latin America and Caribbean. And you can see, if I compare it to Africa, Asia, and other continents, we are significantly leading behind more developed regions. And the development of urbanization has an effect on our communities. And just like every place else in the world, we know that greenhouse gases from buildings is one of the key leading causes of the greenhouse gases. And in the Caribbean, it's no different, as well as industries in our region. When we start talking about nature's rhythm of hurricane season, we are very familiar with what we call Sahara dust. And true to its name, it's the Sahara dust from the Sahara Desert, which is blown across the Atlantic Ocean and affects the Gulf as well as the Caribbean. And there's discussions as to how do we begin to measure this? Is it getting thicker? Is it getting heavier? How is it beginning to affect our communities? Also, part of our hurricane season is the continuous indigenous knowledge that we have from having experienced hurricanes repeatedly, that there's a drip campaign that starts as soon as hurricane season begins, mainly through the government of the Virgin Islands, as well as nonprofit organizations, continuously advising the public of services that are available and ways that you can help other residents and communities. Also, a part of that indigenous knowledge that we know in the Caribbean is that lifestyle of stocking our pantries, not waiting till the hurricane is upon us. Property maintenance when the hurricane season comes, making sure we minimize flying debris, stocking our safe rooms or safe apartments, which helps us in turn be able to remain in our homes after storms and begin to clear guts and waterways to minimize the flying debris. Our most recent significant event is what we have come to call Irma, which happened in 2017. It was Hurricane Irma and Maria, several days apart. And on the right, I also documented the hurricanes over the last 30 years since 1989. Now, I'm sure there are and there were hurricanes before 1989. It's just that they were so far in advance, and I do need to spend some time finding those. But I can tell you from experience of all of these that I've categorized. And so Hurricane Hugo in 1989 was a Category 4, and it was kind of our first eye-opener because we hadn't had hurricanes in so long, recognizing why our roofs were so steep from Danish architecture, and all of a sudden we start wanting to have wraparound porches. But these architectural styles were put in place for a reason. And then in 1995, we had Hurricane Marilyn, which was a Category 5, which devastated the territory as well. And then over the course of the next 5 years, you would see that we had various Category 1 and Category 2 storms. And then there was a 10-year period of no storms. So there's some type of rhythm that we could begin to study that happens over the course of time in its frequency. And then we had a hurricane Category 1 in 2010, and then nothing again for 7 years. And then we have back-to-back Category 5s and smaller since then. But certainly through this multi-event of Irma Maria, we could begin to study the frequency and rhythm of those. And as Noah has identified in the graphic on the screen, these events are very hazardous to our communities, our natural environmental, ecological communities that also are presented with rhythms. These storms cause structural damages to our reefs, and we know that our reefs protect our shorelines, and in protecting our shorelines in return, protecting property and businesses. We know that the rising in the sea temperature is what is also bleaching coral, which affects the fisheries, and that in turn affects people's livelihoods and the ability for people to be able to sustain themselves. And then we move into the rhythm of recovery, government services. These are really automatic. I don't want to make it seem easy, but they're automatic processes that begin to take place because we've learned to adapt through the frequencies of storms. And the government of the Virgin Islands will clearly take the lead, establishing curfews and essential workers, managing roads, the ports, be it air or marine. Of course, the utility company puts out water advisories and tries to restore power to the best of its ability. Price freezes, because we're familiar with the price gouging that happens. And there's so many more other elements that the government, as well as other nonprofit organizations, begin to implement. And then there's the rhythm of aid. So between the multi-event, between Irma, there was no aid, it was just ourselves. After Maria, there was no aid, it was just ourselves. And being able to be self-sufficient until the time that aid is able to arrive. And when they do arrive, they assist in helping us maintain order, distributions of MREs, meals ready to eat, to support the utility in restoring power and water services, providing medical assistance and supplies for our hospitals, assist us in the evacuation of elderly and the hospital. In the multi-event that I just mentioned, we did lose a complete level of the hospital. So it was very crucial, and cruise ships played an important part of that in terms of assisting us in evacuating people. And so in this rhythm of recovery, we have learned to adapt our regulations and just practical requirements. As I mentioned, in '89, Hurricane Hugo really was a wake-up call to us, that we really have to look at how we're building and how we can build back better. In 1995, Hurricane Marilyn, this is when we really began to turn that adaptation into adapting the international family of codes for our islands. And then after that, we continue to adapt by improved preparedness for families and properties to reduce flying debris. At one point, we had a strategy of blow away roofs. Well, we quickly realized that they became missiles, and that was no longer an adaptation that we wanted to be able to maintain. Improving impediments to reducing floods, provide shelter in place strategies so that to reduce the amount of homelessness after storms. To be able to improve our infrastructure with the type of electricity, type of poles that we were using, stronger fiberglass, different burial techniques, burial where we can in low-lying areas, and for roadway drainage. And again, providing safe rooms and safe apartments so that we are able to stay on our properties. And also that recovery rhythm, communication alternatives become very, very important. After those pair of storms, we did not have internet service. We were out of communication for periods of time, long periods of time, and redundancy in communication with paper copies. I know that's old school, but paper copies, information on external drives, of course, being able to access the web when we can, and being able to have and share our personal copies of information. And the next phase became the rhythm of rebuilding. And in this phase, we begin to study the cause and effect and understanding the importance of just sharing information, really paying attention to continuous load paths and evaluating structural systems. The building on the screen is a housing community that was aged and suffered tremendous damage while occupied with residents. And really taking a look at structural systems is an example of what really took place with this property. We also began to investigate mechanical systems. We found that in our assessment in our works that the majority or a vast majority of units on rooftops were not fastened properly. Whether we just thought that it was so huge that the dead load would suffice, a lot of those dislodged and actually began the roof damage and opened up penetrations, basically turning roofs into drains. And another strategy to think of how do we get the water out of these buildings once they've been compromised because of the mechanical systems. Other cause and effects that we've studied is the impact of sustained winds. Even something as simple as a TPO roof, you would imagine there were less mechanisms, but with sustained winds along the edges, we found that they just as easily had uplift and required different fastening mechanisms along the edges. We had a better understanding of the right height ratio for parapets because all of them don't perform the same depending on their relationship to the roofs. We understand that they're not just gutter clips anymore. They're for uplift as well as the weight of the water. We have a better understanding of the type and thickness of glazing and laminate glass that we want to be able to use. We investigated and have a better understanding of how important and critical it is to have a clear and concise water path. We know that we can't stop water, we can only direct water. And the volume of water that's being collected on these rules with these intense storms and the weight of that water, the velocity of that water, how they're dislodging gutters and downspouts, and those all through sustained winds have an effect on the building. And to get the water off of the roof down to the base of the building and away from it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And also to investigate more resilient construction materials. We found that local vendors in the supply of materials took better care in researching and understanding the importance of materials that we need locally as opposed to big box stores. These local suppliers were going to be able to use them on their homes and wanting to have better materials. So local knowledge plays an important part. In the rebuilding effort, we also began to understand the impact of flooding and the impact that it has on our coastline. This map is from the Lieutenant Governor's office, and you can adjust layers to find out the flood zone areas, and everywhere where it's peach, which is basically the entire perimeter of the island. We understand that the corals are diminishing in these areas. There's mass sediment and runoff, and the image on the right is at one of these guts. Some people call them ravines, and it overflowed its bank on a curve, and it began to use the street as a waterway. And what you see there is, you can see cars are buried. It's the amount of dirt that ends up in the bay in those areas. We have a rhythm in the rising sea levels and in the tide. This is an image from the Caribbean Journal of Belongo Beach Resort Hotel. And the owner has made comments in this article as how the beach is disappearing. And not just erosion, but he comments on how the tide seems to be rising. So we understand that we could begin to see the effects of climate change even now. Then climate change also has the ability to diminish our shorelines and our mangroves. And these are very important for protecting our shorelines from storm surges, as well as deforestation, sediment and runoff into the bay. All of these are elements that begin to affect our environment. Flooding has become a tremendous element. This is the St. Thomas waterfront, and heavier rainfalls, as well as sea rising, water not being able to get out as quickly and as efficiently as it has been, also causes flooding. Climate change will, through the increase of droughts, reduce the ability of people to be able to collect water in their cisterns. And as the temperatures continue to increase, the demand for cooling and buildings becomes more in demand. We also understand that as the temperatures continue to rise, that it will have a reduction in the ability of us to yield crops to assist us in sustaining ourselves. And we understand also the importance of trying to manage water on each of our respective properties and on our sites, using retention ponds and other elements to be able to release water slowly. And so you say, Stacy, when you talk about all of these things, what is it that we can do? I like this definition by biology for adaptation, because that's the key of where we are in terms of climate change. And it's the process or the state of adjusting or changing to become more suited to an environment, and the trait as a result of the process. And so, we have to organize ourselves around an adaptation, which is not easy. It sounds easy, but it's not. And then once we adapt, we agree on the adaptation to implement strategies. And all of this is an effort to be able to build back better. There are social implications for climate, for equity, and for justice. And so each one of us as a priority can take it upon ourselves to understand how climate change affects us personally, affects us in our work and in our life, in the things that we love to do, the things that we love to enjoy. We need to learn to use the indigenous knowledge to strengthen our buildings and communities. There's so much knowledge that has been accumulated in the Caribbean that we can share amongst ourselves, each responding to different problems in different ways and learning from those examples. To be able to use community engaged design is very critical to allow the community to determine how they want to be resistant to these particular challenges. As a community, how do we want to respond to the 10-foot sea level rise for Charlotte Amalie and the Virgin Islands, for example. We also must continue to add infrastructure and services on a smaller scale basis for each neighborhood, creating a level of redundancy so the impact of disruption is not as great. We have to learn to adaptation, and incorporate those to educate people and to have alliances. And the most difficult part of it is to make difficult decisions because, you know, in saving as much as we can, some portions we clearly have to make sacrifices, and to be able to make larger investments, which is key for the territory. So I want to thank you for listening to me for the past few minutes, talk about how we can adapt through climate change, through the Caribbean, through the rhythm of hurricane season, the rhythm of hurricane recovery, the rhythm of rebuilding, and the rebuilding of community. I thank you.
So Ken, would you like to introduce the next speaker in the panel?
Well, I thought Stacy was going to do it. I apologize. I don't have.
That will be Shirley Birriel, Osorio, Director of Infrastructure Program Management with Community Development Block Grant Program. Shirley, if you could join us, that would be great.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shirley Birriel. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to represent the Puerto Rico Department of Housing in this conference and provide all our plans to respond to disaster by building climate resilience infrastructure and communities. I greet you all on behalf of the Secretary of the Department of Housing of Puerto Rico, Attorney William Rodriguez, and the Disaster Recovery Deputy Secretary, Attorney Maritzi Diaz. We appreciate being part of this important event. Climate change has always been an important topic for myself. That was what led me to study environmental engineering. I'm currently the Director of Infrastructure Program Management Puerto Rico, in the Puerto Rico Department of Housing, leading the portfolio of all Community Development Block Grant, Disaster Recovery, CDBG-DR, infrastructure and multi-sector programs, which are focused on the recovery and the development of local infrastructure. These are the non-federal match program, also the city revitalization program. In addition, I manage the PRDOH energy efforts regarding the implementation of the CDBG-DR action plan for the electrical system enhancements and improvement, and all of these, the programs under it. As well as the programs regarding infrastructure matters under the CDBG MED allocation. In PRDOH, we have the responsibility to implement programs at a magnitude never seen before. This is definitely a historical challenge, but at the same time, an opportunity to improve and change our infrastructure and our quality of life. I hope this short presentation will help you understand our impact on climate resilience matter. So the Puerto Rico Department of Housing has developed and implemented forward-thinking approach to disaster response and mitigation by building climate resilience and equity in our program design. PRDOH is determined to prioritize projects that reduce the impacts of climate change, such as focusing on the usage of renewable sources of energy, such as microgrids, solar energy, and others. PRDOH is also leading the efforts of decarbonization goals for Puerto Rico through the implementation of approximately 1.9 billion for improvement and enhancement to the Puerto Rico electrical grid. As the grantee for these funds, PRDOH submitted to HUD a comprehensive action plans that delineates unmet energy needs and address critical opportunities for energy resilience. Under this action plan, PRDOH prioritized projects that will reduce the impact of climate change, such as using renewable energy sources of energy, addressing critical infrastructure, promoting decentralization, and prioritizing the most vulnerable residents. In addition, projects that improve the efficiency of electrical power generation, electricity transmission, and distribution that can sustainably reduce impact to climate change. By decreasing transmission and distribution losses, these projects minimize the consumption of fossil fuels in power generation. These electrical power system enhancements and improvement action plans explain the steps that are undertaken to the extent, upgrade, and otherwise enhance and improve the cost effectiveness, reliability, efficiency, sustainability, or long-term financial viability of the electrical power system, including activities to increase resilience of the electrical power system to future disasters and address the impacts of climate change. Projects will be evaluated to identify opportunities for alignment with efforts to increase energy efficiency. PRDOH anticipates approximately 80% of projects funded under the ER2, which is one of the programs under the Energy Action Plan, will qualify as other sources of power, distributed energy, microgrids, and similar projects. Under this program, microgrid integration will extend the benefits of renewable energy and resilience of the behind-the-meter generation projects across a broader population. The action plan also contemplates the energy needs of vulnerable communities in hard-to-reach areas of the island. Additionally, the plan provides funding to the Department of Economic Development and Commerce, also known as DEDEC, to supplement its program for commercial renewable installation, as well as planning for electrical vehicle integration in the island. One of our programs is the Community Energy and Water Resilience Program. Homes unprepared for energy resilience were left vulnerable in the aftermath of hurricanes Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico. Therefore, rebuilding to sustain long-term recovery efforts requires design improvement that incorporate modern technology for life-sustaining purpose during off. To achieve that objective, the Community and Water Resilience Installation Program, also known as CERWI, both for CDBG-DR and CDBG-MID, implements efforts that include the installation of photovoltaic system and battery storage for critical loads of an energy storage installation and medical needs. LMI household, which is low to moderate income household, may benefit from energy production and water storage system that can support health, safety, and long-term needs of the public, while protecting the environment at the same time. In compliance with Housing and Urban Development HUD guidelines for single-family homeowner programs, one of the R3 program objectives, R3 is also known as Home Repair, Reconstruction, or Relocation Program, is to achieve complementary benefits of community and neighborhoods revitalization, promote resilience, and nurture infill opportunities. To achieve these objectives, the R3 program acquires damaged properties from LMI households and provides them with relocation assistance, in the form of a voucher with the purpose of moving them outside of the affected floodplain or risk area. Incidental to the acquisition by PRDOH of the damaged property, PRDOH dedicates and maintains the property in perpetuity as open space for the conservation of natural floodplain functions, other ecosystem restoration, and wetlands management. For reconstruction activities, the program ensures that all projects comply with the standards in the International Building Code adopted by Puerto Rico and incorporated green building standard features and resiliency measures to the extent possible. Green building standards improve the lives of residents, reduce energy demands, increase energy efficiency, and support community revitalization. And also protect the environment. There are significant social, environmental, financial, and health benefits to incorporating a comprehensive set of green building standards. The relocation strategy from PRDOH is even more important when considering the impacts of a coastal erosion and sea level rise. The CDBG-DR and the CDBG-MID portfolios feature sustainable planning programs in order to promote land use planning, mitigation, risk analysis, and thoughtfully integrated approaches to the reconstruction. These programs include the Municipal Recovery Planning Program, also known as MRP, MRP will complement other programs described in the CDBG-DR action plan as amended by identifying projects, programs, and policies necessary for recovery, as well as increasing communities' funding and their capacity to forecast and assign applicable needs to promote city revitalization, critical infrastructure recovery, economic development, and workforce training. Another program within the planning portfolio is Geoframe. The Geoframe program will consolidate the building blocks of existing island laws, programs, datasets, and stakeholders' needs into a single standardized formal system with a centralized and open GIS database resilient to crisis scenarios. The planning and capacity building program is one of the planning programs considered under the CDBG-MID allocation. In this brief presentation, we provide you with an overview of our programs that are addressing or are putting our input into the climate resilience subject. We are in the best disposition to assist and continue collaborating in this effort that corresponds to all of us and contribute in what is in our reach for the benefit of all citizens and future generations. I look forward to your questions, and at the end of this session, thank you so much for the opportunity.
You're on.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for the previous speakers for their good presentation. And what I will be talking about today is a project that we've been working on with a lot of colleagues for the past 2 or so years about creating a comprehensive hazard mitigation plan for the territory. So this talk really follows really well the talk that Stacy gave earlier, and I think she really sort of set up my talk really well when she was talking about some of the challenges that the previous hurricane caused and how we need to think about sort of overcoming some of those challenges. So you heard about the USVI from Stacy earlier, but just to sort of bring you back to the territory of the Virgin Islands, the VI, as many of you on this meeting know, is a complex system of systems, and it works. We have 3-4 different islands that are relatively small, that have, tens of thousands of people for St. Thomas and St. Croix, and then a few hundreds to a few thousand people on St. John and Water Island. And so we sort of have to make it work. We have, a quite complex sort of transportation system that is a mix of private and public ferries, boats, airplane, etc., to move between islands. We have a potable water system that is mostly fed through a desalination plant, but people usually have, the majority of people have what's called cistern, which, hold the water. We have the majority of people on septic as well. And we also have a relatively, I would say, complex to manage electric system, because we have 2 power plants that are on, St. Thomas, another one on St. Croix, and an underwater cable between St. Thomas and St. John. And so that presents a lot of challenges in terms of really having little redundancy and yet being able to function. So we function, we're working, it works. And Stacy also mentioned how, the VI works, even though it's a complex sort of system. Stacy mentioned earlier the impact of the hurricane, and the fact that recovery is going pretty well and aggressively. This was a picture of a road destroyed by the hurricane Maria in 2017. Now this is the same road, completely rebuilt, higher standard for stability, drainage, etc. So things are sort of moving along in terms of improving the quality of the infrastructure in the territory post 2017, as Stacy mentioned also in her talk. However, we need to sort of remain very, very vigilant. We still have a fair amount of hazards. Right now, we're in a drought. We've been in a drought for the past 2 or so years, pretty much. And every hurricane season since 2017 seems to be one for the record. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen this year, but we have a fair amount of hazard that sort of loom and can continue to wreak havoc. And climate change, as was mentioned today and yesterday, is just here to make things worse in terms of more intense storm, sea level rise, making the wave a little bit higher, reaching further inland, et cetera, et cetera. So with that said, we then started to sort of look a little bit about this concept of resilience and how to make the territory resilient. You've probably seen some of those diagrams before, but when you have a natural disaster, you tend to sort of go from a state of stability to a state of instability, and you have to kind of go back to that state of stability. More resilient system can bounce back better than less resilient system, and it will cost less and it will take less time. But the question is, what does that mean? What does that mean? What do we need to basically avoid going on state number 2 and really sort of get to state number 3 as fast as possible? One is to have more robust infrastructure, going back to this image. If this road is not destroyed, then we won't have to spend time and money rebuilding it, and people will be able to go from one place to another faster. But what are the other sort of parameters that really sort of make a system more resilient? And I think that's the question that we've been sort of wrestling with in the past 2 years. So this here is an example of the resilience or lack thereof of the Virgin Islands. So in dashed line is the economic recovery measured by change in employment in Puerto Rico. So Maria, and then recovery. And then those different shades of blue are what happened in a territory of the Virgin Islands after Hugo, after Marilyn, and after Irma Maria or Maria. And you can see that for each of those events, we took some time to rebound, and Irma Maria being the most difficult one for us to sort of rebound. And so from this, we can say that the territory really does have some issues in terms of resilience, in terms of this ability to bounce back. And this has been sort of, put in stark sort of reality when we look at the result of the 2020 census, where we saw that we, suffered an 18% drop in population. Puerto Rico, for reference, also suffered a large drop, I think 12% top of my head, but we are one of the state and territories of the US who experienced the largest exodus of people. So hazards, destructive hazards have consequences on population numbers and economy, on quality of life. And so even though the recovery is progressing relatively well, there are a fair amount of challenges that abound and, you know, that we need to address if we want to recover faster from future disruption. So we sort of anchored our approach in the design of the hazard mitigation plan on 3 pillars. Those are the built environment, the people, and the ecosystems. And what we're saying is that to achieve this physical, mental, and socioeconomic well-being, which is what societies want, we need to have all the systems listed here to work relatively well, meaning they need to be robust and they need to be resilient. So what does that mean? Why is that important? It's important because, as you saw, if you have a shock, a hazard, a surprise, whether it's economic, whether it's natural, whether it's combination of the two, which tends to be the case often, everything gets off balance, and as a result, you know, you lose people and you lose this well-being. So that's basically not what we want. And so the question becomes, what does that mean to have those resilient systems? So the first thing we did is, you know, when we talk about hazard mitigation, we tend to talk about and focus on energy, transportation, communication. We tend to focus on, you know, the critical infrastructure. What we did was expanding this critical infrastructure to solid waste and natural systems, really sort of looking at the ecology and the ecosystem and the benefits that they provide in terms of infrastructure, pure infrastructure, providing, you know, drinking water, providing, you know, protection against storm, providing, you know, relief from temperature, etc. But we also ask the question, what does it mean for the society to function? So what are hazards doing to our essential services, our economy, our housing, our education system, etc. And what do we need to do here in those services beyond just thinking about mitigation against hazard to ensure that they provide those services? Because again, without those, society cannot function. So we assembled a team of, you know, various, you know, from various other universities or private group, but also work very closely with other part of the, you know, government. This plan is a collaboration between VITIMA and UVI. So we really worked very closely with, you know, other agencies to sort of put in place this sort of framework. And right now we are pretty much at this, the design of the mitigation strategies to start, you know, putting the plan. We are hoping to have a draft plan by the end of the year, by September approximately. So what do we find? What are we finding? First of all, we're finding that we have a lot of assets that are at risk. You see in this graph, the fact that, you know, for all the different islands, which are, you know, the various shades of color, and the green represent the total amount of assets that are at risk, wind damage. And so Stacy talked about, you know, a lot about, you know, the need for a better, you know, quality for the construction of roofs and stuff like that to protect against wind. That's a very important message because wind damage is pretty much what's gonna cost us the most. So different hurricanes will have, you know, tremendous amount of damage in a territory. The second one is a tsunami, which is closely linked to the risk of earthquake. And then the last two are coastal flooding and riverine flooding. What's interesting about this approach, though, is that they just look at assets. You just look at buildings. You just look at things and say, okay, how much would it cost to, you know, repair or fix that thing, that asset, that building? They don't really talk about the fact that, you know, the damage to any of those building assets cause disruption. You know, maybe there's not a high cost in terms of repair or rebuilding, but there is a cost in terms of society able to function. If your building is moldy, well, it might not cost a lot to fix it, but it's going to prevent you from going to work. It's going to prevent you from being to be a productive member of society. And so that's a type of question that then we started to ask ourselves. Is it all about just the building? Is resilience just rebuilding things up to standard? So we did this analysis for the different type of hazard. This year, for the sake of time, I'm just going to present you, you know, a result for riverine flooding. What we found is that from a pure, you know, geophysical sort of point of view, we're finding that riverine flooding occurrence is getting worse. It's caused by effect of climate change. Storms are wetter. Most flooding occurs, you know, outside of tropical storms. But those storms are becoming wetter because of climate change. But we also find that because we lack comprehensive land use and water planning, because we have a bit of a laissez-faire attitude in terms of development, development and the conversion of land to a hard surface, impervious surface, and not being able to have the drainage infrastructure keep up with this development significantly increased runoff in the past 40 years. So yes, hazards are worse, but what we do on the land also contributes to the fact that the flooding events are getting worse. As you can see in this picture, buildings are fine. A lot of buildings are built above the base flood elevation, but think about access. Who wants to walk through this water to get in those buildings to actually work? So this will have some consequences on our ability to function. We also find that, you know, this type of event is made worse by the lack of investment in maintenance and lack of enforcement of standards when it comes to building a public infrastructure. We also find that a vulnerable population tend to live in a floodplain, which is at the bottom of the hills on most islands. And those are then disproportionately impacted by those hazards. And then lastly, the economics impact. Again, just not thinking about dollars of concrete, but thinking about well-being of society. Economics impacts are high. Again, who wants to work in those conditions? This is a day pretty much gone for most of the people living in this area. So going still, though, thinking about, you know, the impact on the built environment, this is just a result for St. Thomas Island of, you know, the impact of flooding on the built environment. And then on the left-hand side is the result for a social vulnerability analysis that some colleagues have conducted for all the islands in the territory. And just a visual correlation between the two show you that, you know, regions of high social vulnerability, when those that are, you know, the lowest amount of means to recover from those disruptions are located in those regions that suffer, you know, the most from hazards. And so really thinking about the equity consideration when we're thinking about building, you know, in a more resilient manner is something that, you know, needs to be sort of paid attention to. But we also need to pay attention to the functioning of the territory in general, looking at the delivery of those essential services. So we talked about healthcare, we talked about housing, we talked about education, we talked about, you know, other type of essential services that are critical for the functioning of society. And here in this example, we show the essential services of education. So again, looking at sort of traditional approach of disaster risk mitigation, how many schools are in or near flood zone. So this is for St. Croix. You can see that there are some schools in a flood zone, some school outside the flood zone. We can then say, okay, well, it's gonna cost X amount to fix this one. We don't need to worry about that one, but we need to maybe worry about this one. So that's done. We can make the system more robust. But what does it mean for access to the service of education? What does it mean for children and parents to be able to, you know, have access to education services? So here in this red color are the road network, and you can see that some of the roads also are in a flood zone, and some of the roads are connecting, you know, people where they live to the houses. So access to education is a function of not only ensuring that the schools are protected, but that the roads are also protected so that we don't have this type of situation and parents and children can go and access the service. But we are also asking further the question of, you know, education is important for societal function because it provides all those benefits which leads to a strong economy and a healthy community. But for it to happen, again, you need to have robust infrastructure, robust schools, robust roads that don't flood, but you need also to have robust housing, going back to what Stacy means. So to have good education, we need to ensure that people have good housing conditions. People who live in subpar housing, in housing that have, you know, issues from a structural point of view, or just from a location point of view in terms of environmental hazard, will have more difficulties to learn in school. So it's important to think about strong housing, but good housing. It's also important to think about the quality of the education in the school, and that means to have good counseling, good health services, to have good facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So as you can see, when we start to sort of ask the question about, you know, what does it take for us to be resilient, and what does it take for us to have a good education system that can resist the impact of hazard, we see that we start to touch upon other things that don't have to do with just the built brick and mortar environment, but have to do with other sectors. And the leakages between those other sectors and other systems is what we're trying to sort of build through the construction of this hazard mitigation plan. So I'm almost done with,
Greg?
yes?
Yeah, we're running quite a bit late.
Yes,
We want to make
I know,
sure we have
I'm
time
almost
for
done.
the next speaker.
That yes. So
As soon as you can, that'd be great.
yes, I'm almost done. So as you can see, we are making a difference between a robust system and a resilient system. And the resilient system has to do with ensuring that people can actually do the work in the building that is built. So based on that, we have some recommendation on robustness, improving the robustness of system, which is, you know, the hard type of, you know, investment that we all talk about and like to talk about. But we also have a lot of recommendations that have to do with building this resilience, building this infrastructure for people to deliver these services. It has to do with operation of the system, but also things outside of this system, which is, you know, art and culture, people, opportunities for people to mix and know each other, et cetera, et cetera. So the last sort of slide, the last point that I want to say is that ultimately we have 5 lessons learned that we sort of are communicating through the development of this resilience hazard mitigation plan. First of all, thinking about managing risk. Second of all, think about systems and really sort of think about how those systems can deliver the service. Cultivate collaboration among operators, among agents, having stronger governance of all those systems. I won't go into detail, but some of the issues that were listed related to the, you know, the resilience finding in the territory have to do with, you know, need for improved governance of a lot of systems. And then finally, aligning of plans. There are a lot of plans that are being formulated right now because there's a lot of money associated with each of them. And so it's important for us moving forward to make sure that we build upon each other's idea and build upon each other's efforts. So with that said, thank you very much for your attention, and I have a room hopefully for the last speaker.
Thank you very much, Greg. Our final panelist today is Laura Rivera Carrión. She's the Coordinating Officer for Disaster Recovery of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And on behalf of myself and the panel, I apologize to Laura because her time is cut short, and HUD, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, is the backbone of this conference. So Laura, with my apologies, it's yours.
Okay. I know sometimes, you know, things go a different way that we plan. Well, I'll try to go as quickly as possible. I'm going to focus on the resilient measures that we've incorporated in public policy for infrastructure, but know that this is by no means exhaustive, and both CDBG-DR and mitigation funds cover both housing, infrastructure, planning, economic development, but I shall focus on infrastructure for the time being. And I want to actually say, I saw a question in the chat that how do we get policy writers to listen? We've been listening, and I'm going to focus on the recent changes we made as well in our latest Federal Register notice, incorporating a lot of resilient measures, a lot of the things you've heard today. So our grantees can then implement their CDBG-DR and make grants using those resilient measures, but also with an equity lens. And my last point during the presentation today, which I really want to focus on that, is actually about our citizen participation and equitable engagement toolkit. As Architect Bourne said at the beginning, there's a lot of local solutions, and that's why we need to incorporate the communities in their own recovery. And that may resolve actually part of the gap that Ken mentioned at the beginning. So everything around DR there has to be a logical connection to the disaster. So I'm gonna skip over all of the perhaps very obvious eligibility, but we do require grantees to incorporate mitigation and resiliency measures to protect not only current effects that we saw already, for example, in the hurricanes, but anticipated effects of future extreme weather events and natural hazards and long-term risks. So the vision has to be very long-term, which I know both NPR and USVI, can sometimes be a challenge for local governments to implement and design with a long-term vision. Additionally, this infrastructure needs to describe and be ready to address, incorporate mitigation measures, even if under disaster recovery, and also be aligned with community and regional planning efforts. So an earlier comment by Kent about, how geographical boundaries sometimes do not make sense in recovery. It is, and we approach that in our Federal Register notices in Puerto Rico, and there's municipios and Virgin Islands states and the 3 different islands, but the idea is for grantees to planning at a more regional level, not just by the geopolitical boundaries. But also it requires grantees to assess how your planning decisions affect protected classes, racially and ethnically concentrated areas, and concentrated areas of poverty. So all of your decisions need to be informed by this. And the only way to really understanding if you have data on that. So we'll talk a little bit later about how it's not just about looking at the projects as islands within your recovery, but within the communities they're going to exist in, and you need data to do that. Under CDBG MED, there's a separate allocation. Both USVI and Puerto Rico have to receive both CDBG-DR and CDBG awards, and it needs to meet the definition of a mitigation activity, which address the long-term risk of loss of life, injury, damage to and loss of property, and lessening the hardship goes to Greg's point. It's not just like losing your actual house. It's all of that goes with it, how it affects a child's education, how it affects, health. There's social determinants of health. So it's not just the brick and mortar that mitigation is supposed to, the hazards that mitigation is supposed to address. We made some recent changes in a consolidated notice that was published in February of this year. We're now moving with the 2020 allocation and forward. We're going to require grantees to establish resilience performance metrics to show us the projects that they're proposing. How are they going to measure that resilience? And this is new. This has not been done in the past for our grants. All newly constructed infrastructure with CDBG-DR funds must be designed and constructed in a resilient merit. Again, not only to withstand, the extreme weather events that we experience, but also the impacts of climate change, which is a different approach altogether. And then resilience planning that should permeate the entire effort around their recovery. And then last but not least, I wanna leave you guys with the Citizen Participation and Equitable Engagement Toolkit. We just recently published this in English and Spanish. It's available on our website, and the last slide of my presentation has some links where you can find it. And it is a tool for our grantees on how to do this engagement to bridge that gap between response and recovery that was mentioned at the beginning. And it actually has some practical tools to guide grantees on how to do this in an equitable manner, because it has been shown not everyone has, it recovers the same. There are vulnerable populations that get left behind in the recovery process. So there is a series of 6 steps that we put out there. This is going beyond compliance. This goes beyond of what is required in the Federal Register notices. So we're really excited, and we encourage everyone to check it out. We're also during the fall, we're going to be putting out some trainings on how to do this, but this is a tool that can guide all of our grantees and even beyond CDBG-DR and MED funding on how to engage communities with an equity lens to plan for that recovery. So you can design a recovery that works for you, that takes into account the local knowledge and the local solutions built through generation. So, and then it also say the fact that it's a long-term engagement. So the idea is to be continuous engagement with communities where that infrastructure is being designed, built, and eventually used. So I know we're super out of time, so we leave it there. If anyone has any questions, I will stay around and I can answer them via chat.